And it's really not about any particular religious path or doctrine. It's really a very independent practice.
It certainly is, and I think the religions at one time, or perhaps in certain quarters, do understand these principles, but what we're talking about here is in support of that. So the priesthood could benefit tremendously from this knowledge, and I expect it is in some quarters of the priesthood. But yeah, this is not a sectarian thing. This is not something that is Hindu or Catholic or Sufi or Buddhist, although elements of these things are found in all of those religions. This is really about the neurobiology of the human being and also the psychology and the approach to individual spiritual experience. As someone said that there's a difference between religion and spirituality. Religion tends to be sectarian. Spirituality is not sectarian. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We all own it.
Let's talk about some of the tantric practices that can benefit a couple practicing together.
Well, I think over the long term,
beyond
is
meditation,
really where the fruit of it is. A weekend retreat is not going to do it. Tantric retreats, maybe not so much these days, but in the 80s and 90s, tantric retreats were very, very popular. Mm-hmm. But if you can gradually favor these principles in your sexual lifestyle over time, over 5 years, 10 years, the course of a marriage, it can really transform the relationship. And I can speak from experience on that, where your relationship goes from being less about sex and more about love and more about the ecstatic energies being stimulated by a glance or a touch or a hug. And the joy is just that comes from long-term practice of these techniques is fantastic. And of course, as we get older, our sex life is going to change probably. When we get through the childbearing years and the child-rearing years, or maybe it's not so much about sex anymore, but the ecstasy is there and the response is there, and you have this knowledge, and you've really transcended the knowledge to having it be just your life, your experience in everyday life and in relationships. And it expands beyond the marriage, too, to relationships with all people. It becomes an outpouring of divine love.
I found it interesting reading and listening to your book that you're really not asking anyone to stop their particular ways, using fantasies in their sexual relationships or even curbing the amount of sex that they're having. But because basically you're saying that use all of that stuff to benefit your spiritual practice.
Absolutely. And I think that's a key principle in Tantra. Tantra means woven together, by the way, which is very similar to the meaning of the word yoga, which means union. And what we're weaving together is the elements of our life, as it is, into a spiritual integration. And so to ask somebody to, say somebody is a homosexual, for example, you say, well, you can't get enlightened unless you either develop a normal heterosexual relationship or you become a celibate monk or whatever. To say that to somebody who has that lifestyle within them is not going to help them at all. But if you say to them, follow these principles, favor these principles within the context of the lifestyle that you know is who you are, then it will work. And by the same token, there are people who are inclined toward a spiritual life without a sexual activity, and the same thing goes for them. There are techniques in yoga that work very well for producing the same results, and one of the most effective techniques is a technique that's called siddhasana, which is a way of sitting where you're applying some light pressure at the perineum, which puts a little stimulation there while you're meditating. Well, actually, we develop it during spinal breathing. We don't actually develop it during meditation.
That's a difficult position to sit in.
Well, for people who don't have the ability to bring their heel to their perineum, to their root, a rolled up sock will do just as well. So I don't recall if that's in the little Tantra book, but that's something that's discussed quite a lot in the online lessons and the larger book. It's not a matter of sitting like a pretzel. It's a matter of applying some light pressure at the perineum, just enough to create a little stimulation there that will be doing the same thing we were just talking about in a joining of two people, and that's cultivating the energy pre-orgasmically. And of course, if you're sitting there doing pranayama for 10 minutes, and then later on you've developed it to the point where you can do it in meditation without distraction, without distracting you from the technique of meditation, then you'll be sitting there for 30 minutes with some mild stimulation at the perineum. And this is what Siddhasana is. And it is a tantric technique. And it's a technique that's very commonly used by yogis who are celibate.
And what are the benefits of having that stimulation there? Just for the pleasure of it?
The same as what we were talking about before, having some mild stimulation, some mild sexual stimulation pre-orgasmically is cultivating the neurobiology in the pelvic region and bringing the energy up. Very similar to the way we do with spinal breathing. Okay. Only with spinal breathing, it's a mental procedure with the breath. Here we're talking about a physical procedure that actually acts on the neurobiology itself. And there are other techniques too. There's a technique called Mula Bandha, which is the compressing of the anal sphincter, and a derivation of that is a rhythmic compressing of the anal sphincter, and that also awakens the neurobiology in that area of the root, and that's a technique that we developed during spinal breathing also. And there are other mudras and bandhas that are higher up in the body that we can discuss when we go through asanas, mudras, and bandhas, which may be our next interview, depending on what we decide.
Yes.
So these are just different ways of capitalizing on the same principle, the singular principle of preservation and cultivation of sexual energy.
Okay.
And there are a lot of different ways to do it. It's possible also just for someone who is celibate, going back to more traditional celibacy like you find in the Eastern and the Western religions, it is possible to do that cultivation in a celibate lifestyle through service or through art or through whatever expression there can be for that energy that's life-supporting and not harmful to others.
It's a different type of ecstasy, though, I would say, wouldn't you?
Yes, it is, very much.
Yeah.
But it's we're all kind of been at this for a while. At least some of us have, and you realize after a while that it's not about the gung ho, let's conquer sex kind of mentality that existed when Westerners really first got involved with these things back in the 70s and 80s. And it's really a much more subtle, long-term journey than that involves other elements. And what we're trying to do these days is pull it all together intelligently and apply these things in a practical way that's not going to be turning people's lives upside down, because it doesn't have to.
Yeah.
It can be incorporated into a Western lifestyle just as easily as it could be incorporated into the life in a monastery or life in India or Europe or Africa or anywhere. It's just dealing with the human neurobiology in an intelligent way to unfold its full potential.